Joining us on today's podcast is Sam McSkimming, the Chief Executive Officer of Pilbara Ports, which is responsible for operating and developing a range of ports and port facilities all across the Pilbara region in Western Australia. So we know your name and we know the company that you work for, but I would love our listeners to get to know who is Sam McSkimming a little bit more. So on a personal level, so can you share with us a little bit, Sam?
Sure. What sort of personal things?
Yeah. So just, how long have you lived in Perth, family?
Okay,
how do you blow off steam?
Okay, so I'm new to Perth. I'm a year on the West Coast, just gone a year. Love it. Already a proper Western Australian. I think we don't get enough GST revenue, and the East gets all the attention. So I'm already a native. Kids do well here. I have two kids. I grew up over East Coast. I've always worked in mining, resources type industries. So coming to WA for a mining and resources executive is kind of like coming home, because this is where it's all happening.
Love it. Great. So, Sam, this podcast is all about sharing real and raw stories of impact. And being a member of CEOs for Gender Equity, I've had the privilege of getting a little sneak peek into, some of the things that you're doing and the change that you're driving at Pilbara Ports. So I'd love to kick off by asking you, is there a defining moment or experience in your career that ignited your passion to advance gender equity?
Yeah. So I guess I'd start off by saying I think the defining moment for me was really realising that what I was doing before wasn't working. So I came to the gender equity issue probably from a position of a bit of discomfort. I run businesses. I'm not a social engineer. And at least when businesses started talking about trying to increase the number of women in their business, at least initially I was a little uncomfortable with that, because it sort of offended those principles of sort of meritocracy and those type of things. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I think anyone who tells you that this didn't sort of sit at least a little uneasily with them at first probably wasn't thinking about it very hard, right? But then what I was doing was, applying those, in inverted commas, principles of meritocracy, building very homogenous teams. And in mining and resources, that usually meant teams full of blokes, 40 and up, lots of experience, but very homogenous. And those teams were failing. Or if they weren't failing, they just weren't getting the results that I expected them to achieve. And it wasn't because I wasn't recruiting good people. It wasn't because I wasn't recruiting experienced people. They knew what they were doing. But as a team, they were too homogenous. And it was really then when I started to look again at my own preconceptions around gender and how it can be brought in to your sort of management toolkit as a way of really thinking about performance in your business.
Love it. And so did you have that reflection yourself, or was it raised to you in terms of, yes, good people, great experience, but it's not adding up to the business impact?
So it wasn't. It took a lot of reflection, and it took a lot of thought, because when you hire experienced, capable, professional people, and then you're just not getting results out of them, your initial thinking is, well, what am I doing wrong here? Is it me, right? And probably to some extent it was. But equally, it became apparent to me that a homogenous team was really failing to connect around group problem solving, error identification, innovation, and all of those areas really became the focus areas for me in terms of thinking about how I could improve team performance. And it became clear pretty quickly that the diversity within a team, not just with respect to gender, but certainly gender's a big element of it, was one of the tools that I could use to solve that issue.
Awesome. And so, how did so you started in Pilbara Port Authority, how long ago now?
Just over a year ago.
Just over a year. So, what was the scenario that you inherited, and what have you done to drive change there?
Yeah, so we've been fortunate in that we have, I inherited a situation where we already had reasonably good gender statistics, in inverted commas. I mean, roughly 42% of our workforce were women. Now, the problem with that, though, is it betrayed probably two really significant issues. One was that most of those women were in junior positions. And positions where they really lacked any sort of institutional ability to influence the direction of the company. And so while you got the stats, as it were, we weren't really getting the performance. That is what, in my mind, all good leaders for gender equity really should be driving at. It's fundamentally about business performance. And the second issue was really as a consequence of the women being in junior roles, we had a pretty significant, and still have a pretty significant, gender pay gap. Which, I just don't think is an acceptable state of affairs. So that was where we were. We had lots of women just not in positions of institutional authority within the business, and that was leading to, in my opinion, those same challenges around team performance within the senior team.
And so what was the first step that you took to try and address that? Because, there'd be many people listening to this who are reflecting on the exact same thing. Even if your overall representation of women is decent, quite often women are in those more lower level of influence, lower paying roles. So what was like the first step and maybe some of the following steps?
Yeah, so I think that when you go into a new leadership role, and it doesn't have to be a CEO role, it can be any leadership role, the first week everyone's watching you, right? And so the things you talk about in the first week are the things everyone remembers. And so for me, the first thing you talk about in my sort of role is safety. But the second thing I talked about was really those principles of diversity and inclusion, and how I felt that they needed to be central to the type of performance culture that we needed to build. And so I think coming into a leadership role, if you don't start talking about it from day one, if you sort of come to it, if it's on your to-do list and 18 months down the road, you suddenly start talking to your team about gender, they're going to say, well, when did this come from? So you got to start straight away. And the other thing we did, and we did it very quickly, was we set some targets. Now, I have mixed feelings on targets. I understand the debates around them. But in my view, if you don't measure something, how do you really know it's important? And targets are not things, in my view, that you don't crucify people if you don't achieve them. It's more aspirational. And the particular target we focused on was really, rather than focusing on the overall number of women in our organisation, we wanted to focus on the number of women in leadership roles. Because if you don't get that bit fixed, you're not really solving the actual issue.
That's right.
And so that was the first target we set. We set ourselves an ambition to get to 50-50 in our leadership roles by the end of the year, male, female. We started off with 17% women in leadership. We are nearly 12 months later up to about 30%, so we've nearly doubled. And we might not get to 50%. We set a pretty hard target. Why not? But we're certainly making really good strides.
That's amazing, and I love, the fact that you as a whole new role, new organisation, but just having that focus of gender representation at leadership level. That's one of my biggest pieces of advice to people, is to start at the top. Because if you start at the top, gender equity naturally flows through the business. If those are you have gender balance in that executive team, which, along with yourself are making those key strategic positions, it's just a really smart way of doing it, is starting there, and it naturally kind of filters down. Now, I know another thing that you did was you launched an actual specific diversity and inclusion plan. So can you tell us a little bit about, why you did that and, the impact that that's had at Pilbara Ports?
Yeah, so first I should say, when around that messaging when I started, I think it's really important for leaders in roles now to really be clear when they talk about diversity and inclusion that they need to set a broad church. there is absolutely and appropriately a focus on gender equity, but you have to make sure you're doing that in a context where you're inclusive to all groups. So in some respects, I was really fortunate in that I think coinciding with my first week was Ida Hobbit Day. So straight off the bat, we could have a conversation about LGBTIQ inclusion as well, right? So you set that broad context, which is we do better in a diverse setting. And then for me, the plan is then really about giving people some idea of how that might be done. Plans are important. If you don't plan for something, it's unlikely to actually occur. But equally important within the context of planning is to be really, really focused and prioritised. So a lot of organisations now have D&I plans. Some, in my view, are better than others. The ones that don't work, in my mind, are the ones that are sort of 700 pages of initiatives, because it's just too much. It's just too much. You've really got to boil it down to a couple of key priorities. And yep, you're not going to solve the issue overnight, but a couple of key priorities. And for us, it really was about that leadership. And the other one for us is really about taking on gender equity in the hard areas. So they're the areas where it is actually hard to get women to come and do those jobs. So it's not too difficult to get qualified, capable women to come and be HR professionals or work in your finance team or those type of roles. Much harder to get women who are qualified to come and be marine pilots or work as harbour masters or in some of those very, very traditionally male-dominated professions. So key in our plan was really, let's focus on the hard bits. Bumping up our stats is not what this is about. It's about actually changing our culture, and that means focusing on the tricky bits.
Love it. And, it's quite... I haven't really heard of someone taking that approach before, so I have even more appreciation to have you as part of this community, because I think that's really bold and refreshing, and there's a couple of areas which I've had a sneak peek into that I know that you've kind of actioned and that I actively share as prime examples of how to overcome barriers. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more with our listeners. Maybe if we could start off with how you broke down the barrier to get more women engaged with the harbour pilot position.
Yeah, so harbour masters is probably a good one. So traditionally, and pilots too. So traditionally in maritime roles, it's sort of almost an impulse that every job in maritime, you need a Class 1 mariner's ticket. So a Class 1 mariner's ticket is essentially captain of a large ocean-going vessel. Takes a lot of work to get one, a lot of time at sea, a lot of time away from family, and it is increasingly difficult, therefore, to find people who want to do it. And interestingly, this is a great example of where an initiative that where gender initiatives are actually really convergent with just broader recruitment and talent management challenges, right? Because not only do not a lot of women want to get this qualification because of the time away from the time away from home, relatively low wages, difficult, hard work. Not many men do either, right? And so we're actually at a point where the idea of an Australian Class 1 mariner, they're becoming pretty hard to find and potentially extinct in a few years. And so if we just impulsively require this as a condition of a condition of doing some of our jobs, well, we're not going to find any women to do those roles. We're also not going to find any blokes, right? So we've got to think more carefully around how we do that. And so what we've done is we said, look, if you've got one, great. If you don't have one, we're not going to throw your application in the bin. We're just going to look at your other skills, what your gaps might be, how we can train to get you to where you need to be. As you're no doubt aware, a lot of those lot of the skills you learn, whilst really important on an ocean-going vessel at sea, are probably less important in some of our roles, so those things we're not going to worry about. So it's really about making sure that when you think about talent and recruitment, you don't sort of mindlessly apply a particular type of tertiary or qualification without thinking about what it does to your ability to attract and retain talent, including women.
I love it. It's just a prime practical example of there is a barrier and you just take it away and think differently about it. So can you tell us, by taking away that, previous, essential criteria for that job, So what has been the impact in just like the general applications that you're getting, and then the people who are securing those opportunities?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So we still set very high standards, appropriately high standards. So we haven't exactly been flooded with, in inverted commas, unqualified applications. But if I look at the people who've been appointed into sort of trainee pilot positions or trainee hub master positions without that qualification, off the top of my head, I think there's 4 and 3 are blokes, which sort of goes to that. You really are removing barriers to talent. That talent plays out in different ways, but you are actually opening up the opportunity more.
That's great.
And interestingly, by opening up your approach to these things, we've actually found women who have the Master Mariners qualification, but are more willing to come and work for us because it signals a change in our culture. It signals a change in what we value. We value who you are, your skills, the capabilities you bring to the table, rather than just the tickets you carry.
Wow.
So again, when you approach these things, in my view, you do so in the context of not fully understanding sometimes what the consequences are going to be, but really about making sure that you've got your flexibility set up correctly in how you think about and manage your talent.
And I think it's a really good point that you raise, in that sometimes, yes, there's the intervention itself that you've kind of implemented, but it's the kind of broader impact and maybe the signal of what that says, about you as a leader and Pilbara Port as an employer of choice, so.
Completely, right. So I think the idea, and we saw this a lot, I suppose, in the sort of, in inverted commas, the early days of diversity and inclusion policies where, there was this kind of express, we must recruit a woman into this role through one way or another type approaches. And look, sometimes that's appropriate, but often you don't need to do that, because if you set up how you think about talent right, if you set up how you think about team performance, team dynamics, organisational culture right, the signalling effect of doing that gives you a diverse workforce anyway, without you being quite as directive around some of those issues.
I love that. That's another great point. There's one of our members who particularly talks about doing things in stealth mode. People don't even know, so you kind of, you just do it so organically that it just flows, and, that can be pretty powerful as well.
Yeah.
So when I had the pleasure of being up in the Pilbara and seeing you in action in Port Hedland a couple of months ago, another thing, which was another initiative that was raised, was your how you kind of boosted women in operational roles, which is traditionally again a really tricky space to make progress in. So can you share with our listeners a little bit more about what you've done and what the impact has been in that space?
Yeah, so I think there's probably 2 key things there in my experience. One is easy to say, hard to do. And that's making sure you really understand operational leadership in its broader cultural context, right? So I think the days of the sort of, disciplinarian, tough bloke at the head of an operation, firing people for safety transgressions, you'd think those days were gone, but you will still find that out there. And I think if that is your view of operational leadership, then the 1970s would like you back. But I think making sure you stamp that out and think broadly about operational leadership, well-being, psychosocial safety, just culture around how you think about safety, all those type of things. You have to solve those problems anyway, because modern leadership demands that. And if you solve those problems, you will almost by default end up with more women in leadership. The second thing we did, and this is a really practical one, is, and I think a lot of, managers out there have seen this, is it's pretty common, I think you find, that there's a lot of talented women who came into operations in the sort of early to mid 2000s when those roles became available to them. They've worked their way up to maybe a superintendent type role. And then they kind of get stuck because there's a bloke in the way. And I think one of the things that's really important if you want to build faith with those women and invest in them and continue to develop them is you look at how your organisational structure might be blocking their advancement. And what you often find is that you can kill two birds with one stone, because if your organisational culture is blocking their advancement, you're probably finding that it's hurting you in other ways as well. So, for example, one of the things we did was we had a lot of issues associated with trying to cover a lot of our ports from one role. We said, well, why don't we just cover all the ports with individual roles? Let's take that one role and let's make it 3 or 4 or 5 roles. Suddenly you've got some vacancies there, and lo and behold, the talented women who've been coming up through your org chart put their hand up and were successful. And so really it's using your structure to move your business forward and also to promote and develop your people.
That's another, pretty, it's not rocket science, right? It's like you've got this one big meaty role, but break it down and get more people involved, and it's going to translate through to better business outcomes and provide amazing opportunities to reward people who've been doing an amazing job. So it's
and yet another example I think of where it's pretty unusual to make a decision in business purely with respect to promoting gender equity. What's far more common is you have another problem that you're trying to fix. In this case, how we appropriately led our organisation. And a really great side effect of solving that, a bit of a byproduct, is you actually have an opportunity to promote gender within your business as well.
That's it. But that was obviously with your experience and, like you said, coming from a place of where you didn't feel you did it well before, in previous roles, you obviously had that, awareness that you should, consciously or subconsciously, that at least some women should be involved in some of those roles.
Yeah, so this evolution in my thinking didn't happen overnight, right? And again, as I said, this idea of, for a lot of guys, I suppose, I think, this idea of the best athlete principle dies hard, right? So the best person should get the job irrespective of gender, right? There's, two big issues with that, right? Firstly, how do you define the best person for the job? And as we know, there is a lot of unconscious bias in that activity, and typically that can often be defined very narrowly in a way that favours men. But secondly, and I think more fundamentally, is when you recruit a role, particularly into leadership, you're not just recruiting somebody to come and do a job. You're recruiting a team member, right? And that person has to interact with others. They have to work effectively with others. They have to contribute to the team such that the sum of the products of the team is greater than its parts. And so thinking about style, type, diversity, skills mix, background, inherited and actual biases, thinking about all of those things and how they play it in a team dynamic is incredibly important, right? So if you're recruited simply by saying, who's got the most experience in the industry, let's sort by years in the job and hire the ones at the top of the chart, you're not going to get a good team. And I think it was that sort of realisation achieved through my own many, many failures that I sort of realised the importance of this work.
Thank you. That's a very good reflection. Like you said, it doesn't come overnight, but it's just a lot of review and reflection and thinking about I totally agree. Like, best person for the job, that is completely subjective. You can't say that, because my best person for the job is different from your best person for the job. But I think I've heard a few phrases around that, in that it's the best person for the team and it's the best person for the future as well. So we have to consider like the potential of people as well, not just where they're at right now. So I think that's just a bit of a reframe. And I've been a recruiter in a previous life, so I was definitely guilty of going for the obvious in the past, but I think we're just so beyond that, and in this competitive age, like, it's all about the people.
Yep, completely.
And if there's a room full of me, and or a room, it's no good. The magic happens where there is that diversity and that blend, and we kind of challenge each other and hold each other to account and bring that completely different lens, because as a broad generalization, we are, different genders tend to be wired differently. I think we should shy away from that.
Well, I think the other thing, of course, is that we have the benefit of all this research now, right? So 10, 15 years ago, you didn't necessarily have it in the quantity and quality that we have today. And now it's just overwhelming, right? If you're interested in high performance within your business, within your organisation, you will not get it through building a homogenous team. And whether that be homogenous with respect to gender or homogenous with respect to other characteristics, it doesn't really matter. What's important is that within creating diversity within a team is now quite clearly shown to produce better performance across every metric. There's the sort of the boring ones about how it makes your team produce more profitable business results, but there are more interesting ones. And one of my favourite is that, and one of the ones I've certainly seen in practice is that, heterogeneous teams are far, far, far better at error identification. Homogenous teams, they just keep going down a path.
It's groupthink.
Exactly. Even when they don't know they're making mistakes. And it's through that diversity do you get that ability to spot those errors and trap them early on.
Love it. And so, I'm sure in your own journey towards gender equity and like the amazing work you've done so far at Pilbara Ports, I'm sure it hasn't always been smooth. So can you share, in your journey so far, have you experienced a certain, time or individual who kind of gave you a bit of adversity, and then how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's certainly a lot less sort of organisational resistance to these ideas. You'd hope so in sort of 2024 as opposed to 2004. And so, that idea of kind of, openly hostile workforce reception, I think is largely behind us. I think the challenges I've had in more recent years are really around, and I think one of the traps is that you can't ever shy away from the fact that performance is what you're trying to achieve. And whenever there's been even a hint, even a sniff that somebody has got a role because of their gender, a lot of credibility is lost. And a lot of credibility is not only lost with a male workforce, but a female workforce as well, right? Because all the women who've gone through and successfully achieved roles and are succeeding look on said candidate and go, oh God, they're going to make us all look bad, right? And so one of the things I think is really important, particularly in organisations where this gender discussion is really maturing to a point where there's a lot of women in leadership, and so you're not talking about like one female manager, you might have 50, is make sure that you're holding everybody to the exact same standard. Don't fall into that trap of sort of having a two-speed economy in terms of performance, because that has much broader sort of repercussions through your organisation.
It's a really good point. Thank you. So the profile of the gender equity topic has just gone really skyrocketed in the past few years. And I know that some people, including, some of our listeners, may be feeling like, yes, like we get it. We want to take some action, but might be struggling to think how they can influence this movement. So can you share some, actionable steps that our listeners might be able to take to support gender equity in their own lives and their own communities?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think before we get there, there's a really important point to be made, right? Which is, yes, it has made strides, but I think you'd be naive to think that there wasn't some level of sort of institutional pushback, right? And we've seen this, around, overseas, around things like universities admissions and the consideration of race in that context, and the sort of legislative moves against DEI policies and so on, that there is a sort of a renewed discomfort in some sectors of the community with this. So the first thing I would say to those people is, don't take it for granted, right? Don't just assume because there are more women in mining and resources and heavy industry now than there were 20 years ago that somehow this issue's fixed. The other point I'd make is that I think it's really important that people approaching this area don't lose sight of the fact that it's not all just about professional workplace settings, right? You know, what we know is that, 1 in 3 women globally report that they're victims of sexual violence or other types of violence. We know that 1 in, 35 women live in sort of some type of indentured servitude. We know that women are significantly more likely to experience extreme poverty. And so I think it's really important that those broader issues of women's rights in the community don't sort of become separated from this question of professional advancement. I think we need to be able to do both at the same time. And so what I would say to people approaching this area is, well, look, yes, absolutely, you can think about how you can get more women into your workplace, for sure, and there's libraries full of that material. But the place I'd start is, okay, well, think about other areas within your community where you can also think about these issues, whether it be with respect to going down and, volunteering or having a conversation or thinking about psychosocial safety within a school setting or a church setting or those type of things. I think that's just as important.
And in the home as well, right? Even
Absolutely.
in, the share of unpaid domestic work and caring responsibilities and the type of chores that, you allocate, like all these things add up, right?
Yeah.
And I think that thinking more broadly, yes, the workplace has a role to play, but yeah, the communities and the schools and the churches and the homes, it all adds up to this kind of broader societal level change, which we really need, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important sort of, again, it becomes a credibility prerequisite, right? So if you approach this position purely from, if the only thing you care about is how do you have more women as CEOs or how do you have more women on boards, sure, that's one issue and it's an important one, but there is a huge list of other things we need to deal with as a community. And I think making sure that there is credibility, sustainability and legacy in the conversation about gender equality means making sure that you're thinking about all of those things.
And that's what, I think one thing I love that we talk a fair bit about at CEOs for Gender Equity is that, yes, we can do what we can within the workforce, but also, we're trying to partner and collaborate with government, so we can try and support broader change through policy and procurement, and also like even some of the initiatives around gender equity in the workforce can actually flow into the home as well, such as, bumping up parental leave and taking away the gendered nature of it and providing superannuation payments on unpaid parental leave. And if you offer family and domestic violence, the beauty of it is that we can influence a bit through the workplace into the home. And I'm kind of excited to keep that, conversation and ideas flowing within the CEOs for Gender Equity community.
Yeah, and particularly important, within the WA resources community, right? In a lot of our mining towns, we have big FIFO workforces. People are in company-owned houses. You go out to some of the Pilbara communities, you're not only a company-owned house, but you're shopping at a company-owned shop, you go to a company-owned swimming pool. So the degree of input and influence you have as a business leader outside the workplace into people's homes is really significant as well. And that's an important sort of thing to really be thinking about and making sure you've got some appropriate policies to manage that.
It's a really exciting area, and delighted that to have you as part of the CEOs for Gender Equity community. Just loving what I'm hearing so far in terms of these stories, and I am using those stories to try and inspire and influence more people. So thank you so much for that. Keep up the great work, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast today to try and inspire and influence our listeners to just take that first step.
No, thanks for having me, Ash.
That concludes another episode of Voices of Gender Equity, real and raw stories of impact. I hope the conversation has sparked a passion, revealed new insights, and inspired you to take action on the journey to gender equity. Remember, change starts with each one of us. So until next time, keep raising your voice, keep championing equity, and keep making a difference. This is Ashley McGrath signing off from Voices of Gender Equity, Real and Raw Stories of Impact.